This is Committable. I'm Jesse Mangan, and in this episode, we're talking about assisted outpatient treatment, also referred to as AOT. And you will hear this term, AOT, referred to interchangeably with the term IOC, or involuntary outpatient commitment. And that is because both of those terms refer to the same thing. They both refer to a court process that creates a list of demands that a person must comply with. And to better understand all of this terminology, and to better understand why specificity is so important in these conversations, I spoke with Fern.
My name is Fern. I am the director of Wild Ivy Social Justice Network, which is Wildflower Alliance's advocacy and community organizing arm. Wildflower Alliance, as some people may know, is a harm reduction and peer support community in Western Mass, and we do trainings around the world. I'm also formerly the executive director of an organization called Keep the Promise Coalition in Connecticut. So I have experience in both of the two remaining states that are holding out against involuntary outpatient commitment orders.
And we've talked a little bit about those 48 states that have passed it and why these two remaining states are such an important perspective on this broader conversation. But really briefly, what is assisted outpatient treatment?
So, assisted outpatient treatment is a euphemism often used by supporters, but unfortunately, the language that we're sort of stuck using at this point for what I call involuntary outpatient commitment. This is a process by which a person's community or others in their life that have authority over them, the state, carceral institutions like prisons, etc., are able to petition a court in order to force someone to participate in and attend outpatient treatment. This treatment could include things like forced drugging, mandatory attendance at a day program or therapy in person, limitations on movement and travel, usually around like state lines or county lines, living in a group home, and more. This is typically done under the threat of hospitalization under our Section 12 laws here in Massachusetts, or short-term emergency commitment if the person is deemed non-compliant with the terms of the order. That could extend to things that are as simple as a technical violation, moving in the wrong place, or missing a session of day program or therapy, something like that.
And I really appreciate the importance of language in these conversations, because as you were just talking about, the way force is framed can get complicated because force could mean physically forcing someone down. There are settings where that will happen. Someone is physically forced down and forcibly drugged. But force can also mean the threat of force. So saying to someone, do this or else. And it seems like with this proposed bill, the way that language is set up, particularly as you're talking about a Section 12, which is an involuntary hospitalization, that could involve police coming to your door, handcuffing you and dragging you into a facility. So in this conversation, sometimes when we're talking about force, we're talking about the threat of force, saying to someone, do this or else, and the or else could be police that we send to your door.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard some arguments from supporters of IOC in other states as well as here argue that actually this is a completely voluntary program that people are choosing to participate in. But when you have that element of the threat of force, being carted off to the hospital and detained by police and committed against your will, that doesn't seem like much of a choice to me. So this is why it's really important that we're precise with our language and calling it involuntary.
One of the things that jumped out to me when reading this bill, there were many things, but one was that Section 12, because I've been through a Section 12 in Massachusetts where A psychologist had me strapped down and sent to a hospital on a Section 12. But within hours, once a psychiatrist evaluated me, they said, I don't understand why you're here. There's no reason for you to be here. And so that process, the Section 12, a 12A, can result in you being physically forced into a hospital, released a few hours later because there was no reason for you to be there. But according to this bill, that might still establish some criteria to then be put on an outpatient commitment because this bill is not very clear about what it means when it says Section 12.
Yeah, one of the big concerns about this bill is that it's sort of a de facto expansion of our Section 12 commitment statutes. It's expanding the criteria for which someone could be committed to a hospital against their will. So it's not merely the criteria that were existing, it's also that you could have simply just been out of compliance with your treatment order. So, in the case of IOC, if you happen to miss a day of medication, or if you miss a day of therapy or attendance at a day program, or just step outside of state lines, and someone who has the power to go to court finds out about that, you could get sectioned.
And I've spoken to people in other states who have worked on ACT teams related to outpatient commitments there. And stories I've heard are things like someone went to dinner with their family, but forgot that their psychiatrist had moved the appointment to a different time. And that was all it took for them to get pulled back into a facility.
Yeah. The technical violations that are possible under IOC orders are really absurd in nature because they could just be so simple, just like that. For this reason, a lot of the opponents of this bill and IOC where it exists have compared it to probation orders.
I want to explore that analogy a bit because it might seem extreme to some people to compare a community ordered treatment to probation. But if we walk through that comparison, it's essentially saying follow these rules, follow these guidelines, report to this person, or else you might go back inside a facility. And what you're required to do could be where you live, it could be who you talk to, it could be drug tests. So, what are the ways in which this comparison actually has merit?
I think one of the things that really stands out to me about the supporters of this bill, the argument that the supporters of this bill are making, is that they're saying this is a way to keep people out of facilities, keep people out of the hospital. In a sense, that is purportedly also the goal of a probation order. But the problem is, when someone actually is in the community and under one of these orders, they're living under such restrictive circumstances. And to take it a step further with IOC specifically, it's not just about getting people out of those facilities, because we know this is happening under the threat of recommitting someone if they step out of line. But I really have to point out the other piece of this, which is most of the commitments that this would supposedly avoid are commitments that would last a much shorter period of time than for IOC. So an IOC order might last, a person could be recommitted under IOC. It could just keep happening indefinitely. Whereas, at least with some of these involuntary inpatient commitments, there's an expectation of a shorter amount of time that someone's actually living under the authority of the psychiatrists, of the clinicians, of the state.
I think with Section 12 in Massachusetts, there is the 72-hour or 3 business day. Weekends and holidays don't count. Theoretical limitation, but that limitation can be extended to, well, now we're going to see if we take you to a hearing, and they can take it up to a hearing and try to get a commitment. And so there is these theoretical checks. And with the involuntary outpatient commitment bill that's in Massachusetts right now, I believe it says 1 year sort of reviews. It lasts for 1 year, and then they review whether or not to extend it. One of the concerns I have specifically when we're talking about these civil processes, which have more gray around due process than the criminal process. There are other states where people are convinced to waive their right to a hearing, to waive their right to a review. And I think that speaks to the coercion element you're identifying, that if you are living under the ever present threat of maybe the most traumatic experience of your life could be relived, we can bring you right back there. If that's always there, being told, do you really want a review? You might not want to upset the people who are in charge of your life.
That is a very common thing that we hear from people is that they were simply too afraid to disagree with the physician who's recommending that they remain on this type of order or under, some sort of forced treatment. And so the coercion piece, when we talk about force and coercion, is really doing a lot of heavy lifting. I think most of the support for this bill comes from two places. One, it comes largely from very affluent white parents of children who maybe have made some life choices or have a disability that they have a carceral view of, that they have a negative view of. And in the case of IOC, what these folks are essentially demanding is more control. Several of them described already having access to so many levers of control through the state and through forced treatment, and yet feeling it was still not enough. I have to point out, like, one of the arguments used by these folks in particular that was repeated as ad nauseum throughout the hearing is this idea that this only applies to people who have incurable brain diseases, which, if left untreated, will result in permanent brain damage. There's no evidence for this. And actually, to the contrary, there's more evidence to suggest that the long-term use of psychotropics, especially, as the ones that would be forced through this bill, do more to permanently alter the chemistry and structure of the brain. So what we're talking about, in a sense, is forced disablement based on the perception of disability. And when I think about these folks in particular, I think about the similarities to discussions that were being had 70 years ago about the idea of lobotomy and the way that that was applied specifically by very affluent, oftentimes white parents who had the same views of their children's madness and disability. This is the same mindset. And the problem is, beyond just the impact that it has on their own children, this has a disparate racial impact on Black and brown folks. And that is the state's interest in this.
There's so much complexity to some of the research. I think there's some research about first time psychosis that often gets misrepresented to make these claims. And I would encourage everyone to look into the research themselves, reach their own conclusions. But when you're talking about that history, when you talk about that history of lobotomy, of some of the true horrors of medicine and psychiatry specifically, I think it's easy to view those as remnants of the past. But one of the things that I think makes this very real in Massachusetts is Massachusetts has laws dictating how and when forced medication should be viewed appropriate. So those laws exist. But if we're talking about electroconvulsive therapy or any form of using electricity as treatment, we can look to a lot of cases that have happened in recent years related to the Judge Rotenberg School in Massachusetts, where they're allowing forced shock as a form of, I'm putting air quotes here for everyone, treatment.
I think Leah Harris spoke to this really well in their article covering the hearing. They wrote about this term force washing, basically the idea that proponents of the use of force, and specifically in this case, IOC, have made it part of their strategy to cloak the carceral and forced logic of these policies underneath this veneer and language of care. And so when we talk about what we consider treatment, this is exactly what you were talking about with the idea of electroconvulsive therapy and the shock aversives that are being used at the JRC. This is also the case for forced treatment like IOC. And I think as far as compliance goes, I want to make this point. Something that is so often said by supporters of forced measures is that the force is necessary because without it, the person would not agree to treatment. Either that or they make some sort of argument about that person lacking capacity to agree to treatment. It's the anosognosia label. What stands out to me about this sort of legal argument is that the most common factor when this label is applied to people and when courts decide to step in is that the person has disagreed with the recommendations and desired course of action of their physician. In any other field of medicine, we call that withholding informed consent, and that's considered a right.
This question of compliance and anosognosia, which we'll have to get into more depth in another episode because it's a huge topic, I think it ties into another element of this bill, and I wanted to find the specific language of it because a lot of outpatient commitment bills offer some sort of attempt or lip service to the idea that the person being put on the court order was consulted in some capacity. But this bill has a section in it, I'll just read it right here. The petition shall include a written critical community mental health service treatment plan, prepared in consultation with, when possible, those familiar with the individual, the superintendent or physician in charge of the care of the individual, or those familiar with the case history of the individual. There is no required attempt to actually ask the person what works for you.
So, in disability organizing community, we have a saying, nothing about us without us. This bill is everything about us without us. And I think what is one of the things that's very notable about it is that the number of people that this bill invites in to have a say over a person's own medical treatment is massive. The bill lists anywhere from family members to the superintendent of the facility that a person may be in, to if someone is coming out of Bridgewater, the forensic facility in Massachusetts, the Bridgewater administrators. It could be a spouse or domestic partner. It could be a probation officer. So many people that have the potential to abuse this power. And in fact, one of the things that has been brought up is that IOC is a tool for abuse, especially when people are in domestic violence or intimate partner violence situations. Similarly, we know how often people get called in on technical violations of their probation and parole. Involving someone's probation or parole officer in this type of order could lead to a similar situation. I'll say myself, as a trans woman, I've had very difficult experiences with my own family at times where various aspects of myself and my behavior were pathologized. Luckily, I grew up in Connecticut, a state without IOC, but for one individual in my family, I know this person's views of the way that this person viewed me when I was growing up. To think that this person, if we had simply lived in a different state, would have the ability to petition a court to commit me on the basis of their perception of my disability, on their perception of what's wrong with me, that is terrifying. And I think that this really goes to the point that these orders are not only really aligned with the Trump administration's policy, but they stand to be weaponized against the people who have been most targeted by the Trump administration. So I mentioned briefly before that where IOC orders exist, there is always a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown folks. I believe that that will be similar for immigrants, for trans people, for disabled people, others that have been targeted by this administration.
I think the terror, the fear you're describing exists not just when a court order is actually present, but the very idea of a court order being possible. And I wanted to ground that for a moment in case anyone thinks that it sounds overly dramatic. If we look at two elements of this, one being the Section 12 element, which we already discussed, could simply be any clinician who signs a form that gets you restrained and sent to a facility, even if just for a few hours, where someone at that facility says this wasn't appropriate, that would still count as a qualifying element that could be used for this bill. And if we then connect that to another element in this bill, which is that it uses the term severe mental illness, which has, as far as I know, no definition in Massachusetts state law. So what we would be creating with a bill like this would be an incentive for anyone who thinks someone they know, because one of the criteria, as you were talking about, is any responsible adult with a significant relationship to the person who you want to target with a court order. That's all it takes to be eligible to fill out this petition. And if you don't like what that person's doing with their life, you could get them Section 12, even if just for a few hours. Then you could find someone who can interpret severe mental illness in whatever way you need them to interpret it. And now you have them in this court order process where you can potentially mitigate, control every aspect of their life. And the final thing I'll say on that, in terms of abuse, is at the very end of this bill is mention that the court can require the estate of the person who's being targeted by the court order to pay for the services.
That last point is so important. What this bill does is it creates unfunded mandates for all of the services that it's saying should exist. In reality, we already have so many alternatives to this in Massachusetts. So I work for Wildflower Alliance. We have two peer respites, including the world's first LGBTQ plus peer respite. There are several other peer respites in Massachusetts. There are also other programs that are designed to support people who are maybe hearing a voice for the first time, right? There's vague criteria in this bill about something which is worded serious demonstrates psychosis. I think there's a typo somewhere in there.
Yeah.
But to the point about serious mental illness and that label, I so appreciate you bringing up the lack of a definition there, because not only does it lack a definition in state law, there's not really a biological basis or any good reason to group certain diagnoses together and call them serious mental illness. It's a social construct. And I think that this is really evident where in the hearing, some of the parents who were supporting this bill stated on more than one occasion, my own child, who I am seeking, this person is seeking an IOC order against, and that's why they support this bill. My own child had the nerve to accuse me of being mentally ill. And therefore, that is the reason that I know they are mentally ill and not aware of their mental state. This could be so easily flipped if not for the inherent power dynamics within the relationships of abuse that enable IOC.
My introduction to the categorization of severe or serious mental illness was primarily in relation to seeking accommodation, in which case, if you're seeking disability related accommodations, such as like SSI, the categorization of severe is about the severity of symptom rather than a specific category of underlying condition. And so to see that concept, which I think in terms of accommodations has a degree of sense to it, that like, yeah, accommodations, if you're talking about the severity of the need for the person, we could talk about severity of need, but to create a separate category is a different level of social construct, as you were talking about. I think it I think it connects to something that I've been trying to figure out, which is that far more often than not, it seems like these forms of court order are a concept more than a policy, a concept that was sold to a desperate family member or loved one that this will save your person. And I think we heard some of that in the hearing about if we had this, my child would get a job, they would go back to school. And I think there's a really hard conversation that needs to be had in some situations that maybe isn't being had, which is sometimes maybe back to work isn't the goal. Sometimes maybe back to school isn't the goal. If you're really, really worried about your person going to jail or being unhoused, if that's really the goal, then let's talk about having everyone avoid being unhoused. Let's talk about having everyone avoid being jailed. And if that's not the conversation, then why is it that you think your person is so deserving of being pulled out of this system, but other people don't deserve that?
There's no magic pill, and I mean that both literally and figuratively in this case. The irony, too, of those statements and the very real desire to see one's loved one thrive is that IOC orders prevent that from happening. So if you're being ordered by a court to attend a day program every day of a week at a certain time, you can't work or go to school, certainly not as easily. And that may not be the person's choice. And so when we talk about alternatives to IOC and things like peer respite, which I mentioned, peer support, housing first, sometimes it's not just a matter of housing first, but housing only, if that's the person's choice. The idea of not conditioning someone's basic needs and quality of life on whether or not they are willing to take the steps to be deemed compliant by the state. I think this is a really important point because I've seen many people who are in support of these sorts of measures often talk about, well, I have this family member who's unhoused and doesn't want to take any of the steps. But the question that you have to ask is, whose steps are they? Because there's a very real systemic problem that the state has the power to fix, but it seems doesn't have the willingness to fix. Whereas IOC, I think to many people, looks like an easy out. It's not.
I appreciate the reference to the idea that there's no magic pill. There's never a guarantee in mental health policies, but you were talking about alternatives, things that can be a really important tool to try. What other alternatives do exist in Massachusetts right now?
So, I mean, in particular, I mentioned that we have peer respites. The idea of a peer respite is it's a voluntary space where people can stay during times of extreme distress or crisis. It is not a space where people get locked in. People can come and go as they please. They remain in community. And the support that's offered is non-carceral. If someone talks about wanting to die or hearing a voice, the reaction isn't going to be pathologizing that person. It's not going to be calling the cops on them. It's going to be curiosity and exploration and trying to find meaning in those experiences and how to navigate them. So we both have peer respites as well as community supports, both in the 4 community centers that we have in Western Mass, as well as community bridging teams who will do anything from meet with a person in community to have a supportive mutual relationship with that person to supporting folks while they're still in facilities. Those are some of the things that we do, as well as groups and online groups using the same principles. We consider these harm reduction approaches not only in that we are not calling the cops and pathologizing people, but also in that we're not saying that there is any moral value in what a person does to survive. In many cases, when people are lectured and scolded and punished for making the choices, the very hard choices that they've had to make in order to get by in this world, it turns people away from the system. And that's often when the system starts to double down and say, no, we're going to force you to do this. Besides that, we need more things like housing first, right? We need things like universal basic income. People need health care. They need to have their food and basic needs and childcare taken care of. These are things that we don't have to condition on whether or not a person is deemed compliant with treatment. And I think, unsurprisingly, making sure that those needs are met when someone expresses those needs are far more likely to result in that person living a more meaningful life that they chose to set forth.
I think you're identifying one of the existing concerns related to this sort of bill throughout the country, which is that in pretty much every place I'm aware of, there becomes a long-term conflict between state declaration and county implementation. And if you look at a place like Massachusetts, which is already strapped for resources and already struggling to really try and meet the needs of the people in the communities, the people in the counties. If you have a state law like this that would say if the county doesn't do what they're told, they're going to pay $1,000 a day, I think, in violation. Well, where's that money coming from? Someone else was probably trying to engage in services voluntarily in their county. The county is trying to, in theory, connect more locally with the people and the needs there. And now you're telling the county, you've got to take those resources away from the people you were helping and then, I guess, give them to the court. And the court can also, while doing that, be charging the person on the court order. And I don't understand who that actually helps.
So much of the use of force in psychiatry, and specifically IOC, is shifting the blame of state policy failures onto the people that the state has failed. And so instead of saying, hey, we're going to put someone under a court order to mandate treatment, or we're going to lock someone up, the state simply could have chosen to invest in the types of supports that would make a difference in that person's life.
As we bring this interview to a close, is there anything about this topic, about involuntary outpatient commitments more generally, or about the bill in Massachusetts that you think people should know?
I think we covered a lot of it. There's still many, many chances to kill this bill. Myself, Wild Ivy, and the broader coalition to stop IOC in Massachusetts are going to be doing a lot of work within the next few weeks and months to make sure that this bill dies.
That was my interview with Fern, director of the Wild Ivy Social Justice Network. And in that conversation, Fern referred to the concept of force washing, a concept coined by independent journalist Leah Harris to refer to the ways in which carceral forced interventions are rebranded using the language of care. And next episode, I'm going to speak with Leah about this concept of force washing and the concerns that arise when forced interventions and the erosion of civil rights are rebranded as care. That's next time on Committable.